Quick disclaimer that I'll be talking about some grown-up games in this video, and I know some children watch me, so here's your heads up. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'd like to talk about how Breath of the Wild 2 could be inspired by other games that we've seen released fairly recently. The reason why I decided on this video this week is because we've already had confirmation that the Zelda team is looking to Red Dead Redemption 2 for certain aspects of the next game, which leads quite well into the first game that can inspire the next Zelda game, and how it could. In the case of Red Dead Redemption, I believe that the main source of that game's inspiration for a Zelda game would be the amazing way that it held companions as a key gameplay aspect. Anyone who played the game in the last couple years will know that your horse is a genuine bona fide part in the story. The game features you being able to, and really having to, feed your horse so that it could perform better. This increases your likelihood of getting out of gunfights and really makes your journey around the overworld that much easier. One of the biggest sources of inspiration that I can think of and that I keep coming back to in these videos is the storage for horses. You could store guns and other stuff on your horse's saddle. Now it's time to talk about mounts in Breath of the Wild. I plan to talk about this further in one of my videos in the future, but since I think this is something that could be improved heavily, it's definitely earned its spot in this video. Horses and general mounts in Breath of the Wild were fairly disappointing overall in my opinion. I know everybody didn't get the Champion's Ballad DLC, but after getting the Master Cycle 0 from that quest, all horses felt kinda unneeded. And even during the periods of the game where I would have wanted to use a horse, I was too enthralled by exploring every nook and cranny of Hyrule to get shrines and Korok seeds. So until very late on in the game, I felt no intent of using a horse, and the bike is so cool that it turns into the only thing I want to use. The game gives you the Ancient Saddle, which gives your horse 2 more spurs of energy in theory, and then gives you the Master Cycle 0, rendering them fairly useless. And of course this is without talking about the lack of storage on the horses and other mounts. I put a saddle on my horse, that should mean that I get some sort of storage, but nope. You get the idea by now, but I'm hoping that these are the next changes made by the Zelda team taking inspiration from Red Dead. Now it's on to the next game, and of course from now on it's not clear whether we'll actually see these. Next up, I'd like to very quickly talk about Ghost of Tsushima and how it literally naturally pushed players in the right direction. Breath of the Wild pushed players in a natural direction using various methods, such as placing stone taluses in random locations near the Great Plateau. In fact, I'm sure that 50% of people watching this video went to the Divine Beast Varuta as their first Divine Beast, as the game naturally pushes you over to the Lanayru province for it. Ghost of Tsushima used a very different and a more literal approach to natural exploration. I mean that nature could push you towards certain collectibles and gameplay markers. For example, when you made your own custom marker for an area you'd like to go to, instead of your heads-up display being bombarded with giant markers telling you where to go, all you have to do is follow the wind. Do this by following the airwaves of the leaves flying in a particular fashion. The game also had shrines, but not in the way that us Breath of the Wild fans know them. Instead, these are of a more Japanese fashion and show the belief of certain things. To get to some of these shrines you can follow foxes. Once again, this brings a more literal meaning to natural exploration, and while it's not innovative in any way, I believe that Zelda could implement this amazingly. Perhaps a sort of animal or creature could lead you to a certain mini-dungeon. Either way, I'd be interested to see it in a Zelda game at some point. Breath of the Wild is one of the most amazing games to explore in my opinion, and I'm not saying that it should just take Ghost of Tsushima's exploration by any means. Quite the opposite, since I think that Ghost of Tsushima has some issues of its own in that department. But I do think that just adding some of these features in the next game could heavily impact how much fun we have exploring the world, especially if we travel through Hyrule once again. Now this is one of the bigger changes that I've decided to include in this video, and I've talked about the impact of the series on the first Breath of the Wild a little bit before, so it's only natural that I'll talk about From Software's own genre of gameplay first created in Demon Souls. You'll likely only see PS5 Demon Souls gameplay visuals right now since that's the newest game in the series. There are 2 parts of these games that I would love for the Zelda team to implement in future installments. Believe it or not, it's not the difficulty or the scope of some of the games. Instead, I'd like to talk about some of the finer details. But first, a major feature in the games must be discussed: the combat. Breath of the Wild's combat was great compared to many games in the series. Without going into Magnesis, Stasis Bombs and Cryonis, just plain sword fighting was fun for a while. The most revolutionary change in this department was the inclusion of the parry for many. This move was needed in the final boss fight and in many Guardian fights to risk you being blown to smithereens. The move was a necessity in the trial of the Master Sword in fact. Now my issue stems from there being less combat options than in some other Zelda games. For example, in Twilight Princess you could do many more things than in Breath of the Wild combat wise. Shield bashing to take your enemy off guard was an option, never mind all of the skills taught to the hero of Twilight through the hero's shade. But let's stop talking about how the next game could be influenced by Twilight Princess and go back to the Souls series. First, I'd love for the Zelda developers to try and turn the roll into a real combat mechanic. Breath of the Wild was one of the first Zelda games where you couldn't actually roll. So why not bring it back at some point, similarly to how the Souls series uses it? Rolling could dodge certain enemies' attacks. These are really the only things that I'd like the Zelda team to change in the combat department. Take inspiration from one of your older games' combat and the Souls series, and they are golden. Now, the bigger piece of inspiration to take from the Souls series would definitely be the boss design in my opinion. I think that Breath of the Wild took inspiration from Souls and Monster Hunter types of bosses down to how the bosses were laid out. Instead of having one weakness to exploit, the game actually had you fighting a boss rather than treating it as if it's some sort of puzzle. Though this could still be outdone by just shooting them in the eye, I happen to think that the boss design in the Souls series is second to absolutely none. Hideous, grotesque beings that could be 10 times the size of the player outwards and upwards, or perhaps they're just fallen swordsmen from a time long ago, similar to that of a Dark Knight with tons of lore behind them. They could even be a simple mage with healing powers. I've complained about Breath of the Wild's boss design too much in the past, but it goes without saying that the Blight Ganons weren't anything special. It was basically the same boss 4 times with less of a change than anybody would have liked, much like the dungeons themselves, coincidentally, but we'll dig into that a bit later. The point is that the actual boss design of these colossal beasts would be very welcome in the Zelda series to me. Having to find a real weakness to a boss rather than just having to use an item would be very rewarding. I'm not telling the Zelda team to take the difficulty from the Souls games, I'm just asking them to change up how the bosses look. Just a single boss that looks like the blood-starved boss from Bloodborne, or like how Iodex Gundyr in Dark Souls 3 would look, would be beyond amazing compared to what we've gotten recently in the games. This is an extremely niche one, and I know some people have already covered the prospect in the past, but I also feel that this is something that I would adore. Anyone who's played through Resident Evil 2 will probably agree with me too. Maybe it would stress some players out, but here we go. The game had an antagonist called Mr. X. After unlocking him through your progression, he'll hunt you down through the area you're trying to explore. Like, in real time, he will actively hunt you down depending on your actions. This creates a fear for the player that it may catch them. This makes the player question their every single move while listening for Mr. X's footsteps. Every time you go down to a dead end, you question your decision, and if you find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time, then you have to pray that the Titan won't find you hiding out in a room as footsteps draw near. This sounds unlikely for a Zelda game in the overworld, but imagine running through a dark dungeon and a giant guardian, spider, or otherwise a giant mini-boss clouds your way. You defeat it and slice off one of the boss's legs. It limps away, angry as ever. After a few minutes, the spider starts to hunt the hero whilst down to gain revenge for its leg. The pitter-patter of the spider above you rings clearer until you realise that it's hunting you, so you hide from it for the rest of the dungeon, forever dreading the day that it finds you. That would be the definition of thrilling. Now, I'm slightly conscious of time, so let's skip through my next 3 with relative speed. First of all, Breath of the Wild had some tricky combat sequences, but I'd love to see if there were some tricky jumps just to engage the player that little bit more, similar to a Mario game or a Sackboy game. Or even by using a grappling hook, some dungeons could be made harder like the Wind Waker. A relatively easy idea to implement. I've played a small bit of Cyberpunk 2077 and Rockstar games in the past, and I'd like to see rupees used for longer lasting purposes in the next game. Buying mounts or something like this would be hugely appreciated, or trading mounts with other people in the overworld. The reason I say this is because we are positively showered with rupees now, and it sometimes seems like there are minimal uses for them. So that would be quite a nice inclusion in the next game. My final piece of inspiration for the Zelda team would be Persona 5. Persona has a much different style of gameplay to Zelda, but it does have a sort of dungeon equivalent that the characters call palaces. These take multiple days to go through in game as they're so long. You can reach save points so that you can instantly teleport to these points when you next enter the palace. Well, I think that they should make dungeons in Breath of the Wild 2 infinitely longer, and add these save points so you don't feel like you have to finish a dungeon your first time round, making them much easier to traverse over the course of the game. Perhaps only I want this, but here we are. One more thing for Persona. The game's music is astounding. I'd love if the Zelda team could try some sort of jazz music somewhere in a dungeon or something. Again, personal preference, but here we are. You have now made it to the very end of this video. Which games do you think Breath of the Wild 2 could take inspiration from and should take inspiration from? Please do tell me in the comments and tell me which aspects the Zelda team could grab from. Thank you for watching this video, and if you'd like to support me, I'd appreciate it a great deal if you could leave a like rating and subscribe, as we're pushing for 750 subscribers right now. If you'd like to support me in any financial way, then the best way would be to go to my Patreon, as the lovely people on screen here have done already, and a special thanks to my top Patreon, Sumji. If you'd like to join them, then for as little as £1 you can support me and put your name up here. The links for my social media are also in the description along with that. Follow them to keep up to date with me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next week.